Welcome to Sherlock Tales, where every mystery comes alive. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, and share it with your fellow mystery lovers. Tell us in the comments, which part of the world are you watching from? Let's solve mysteries together.
It was one of those unseasonably chill mornings in early June when the sun seemed to hang uncertainly above Baker Street, its warmth dulled by a stubborn mist that clung to the cobbles like a curtain yet to be drawn. I was breakfasting alone at 221B, for Holmes had not returned the previous night, having vanished without word shortly before dusk with nothing but his walking stick and a folded scrap of newspaper in his coat pocket. I had grown used to such abrupt excursions. Indeed, I often fancied that Holmes relished the melodrama of his unannounced absences as much as the deductions they inevitably spawned. Still, I was halfway through my second cup of coffee and the final page of the Times when the door below burst open with a crack and a flurry of steps thundered up the staircase. A moment later, Holmes entered in a cloud of coat-tails, his boots crusted with what appeared to be red clay, a smear of soot on one cuff, and the unmistakable glint in his eye that foretold adventure. "Watson," he declared, tossing his gloves toward the table but missing it entirely. "Have you ever heard of roses growing in granite?" I blinked. "I can't say I have." "No, nor I. Until this morning." He yanked off his coat and dropped into his armchair with a dramatic sigh. "Which is why, my dear fellow, we are in the very early stages of what I believe shall become a rather unique problem, one involving a disused cemetery, a missing antiquarian, and, yes, a rose that by all natural law should not exist." I set aside the paper and leaned forward. "Start from the beginning, Holmes." He steepled his fingers, eyes narrowing. "Last evening, while you were no doubt occupied with your notes on the Hatherley affair, I received an urgent but oddly phrased telegram. It was unsigned but referenced a matter of impossible growth at Greyfriars Close. Curious, I went at once. Greyfriars, as you may recall, is the disused burial ground behind St. Luke's in Clerkenwell, boarded up for years and long overrun by brambles and decay. Nothing has been planted there since the great cholera scare of '68. I nodded, vaguely recalling the iron gate and the towering stones etched with half-effaced names. "Imagine my surprise," Holmes went on, "when I arrived and was greeted not by a person, but by a sight. There, in the center of the graveyard, rising between two moss-covered stones, stood a rose bush. Not wild, but deliberate. Cultivated, trimmed, healthy, and in bloom." He paused to let the image sink in. "Someone planted it?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "That is precisely the question. The ground is solid granite, Watson. There is no visible soil beneath the stones, no cracks, nothing to nourish roots, and yet the bush is not only thriving, it is producing crimson flowers of such vibrancy that even a botanist would call it unnatural." He rose and paced to the window. "Now add to this picture a second puzzle. A man named Peter Drelincourt, a retired bookseller with a peculiar interest in medieval horticulture, disappeared from his rooms in Holloway 4 nights ago. No struggle, no theft, no note. Vanished, as if folded into the very fog." "That name rings faintly," I said. "Drelincourt? Didn't he lecture on grave plants?" "Symbolism in sepulchral botany, to be precise," Holmes said. "He was obsessed with the meanings Victorians attached to cemetery flora. The weeping willow for mourning, ivy for fidelity, the rose for love transcending death. And now he is gone, and in a graveyard long forgotten, a rose blooms from stone. Coincidence? I think not." I stood, now fully engaged. "You believe Drelincourt planted it?" "I believe someone did, and I believe that act is a message, or a lure." Just then, a sharp rap sounded at the door, and Mrs. Hudson's voice filtered up. "Mr. Holmes, Inspector Lestrade's here." Holmes barely had time to flick his eyes toward me before the Lestrade appeared in the doorway, cap in hand, his usual expression of professional irritation tinged, I thought, with genuine concern. "Morning, gentlemen. Holmes. This won't wait. I've a man dead in Clerkenwell, found at dawn, not 10 paces from where, I'm told, you were poking about last night." Holmes's eyes lit up. "A man?" Lestrade nodded grimly. "Middle-aged, beard, spectacles in his coat, no papers, but there's a note pinned to his waistcoat pocket. 3 words, in florid ink." "And they are?" Holmes asked, already retrieving his coat. Lestrade's voice was flat. "Follow the bloom." We stared at him in silence. Holmes gave a low chuckle and turned toward me. "Watson, bring your revolver and your thickest boots. The rose, it seems, has begun to bleed." And with that, we followed Lestrade down the stairs and into the morning fog, already thickening as if determined to hide whatever secrets bloomed among the stones of Greyfriars Close. The ride to Clerkenwell was made in near silence, save for the rhythmic clatter of the hansom cab's wheels and the occasional sharp comment from Lestrade, who seemed torn between professional jealousy and genuine discomfort. Holmes, as was his wont during moments of intense concentration, kept his arms folded and eyes half closed. His long frame leaned ever so slightly toward the window, not to look outward, but to withdraw inward. I knew better than to interrupt such a mood. I, meanwhile, occupied myself with piecing together what little we knew. Drelincourt's disappearance, the anomalous rosebush in granite, the grim note on the dead man's body. It had the texture of something ancient and deliberate, as though we had stepped into the middle of a ritual whose meaning was just beyond reach. Greyfriars Close was just as Holmes had described. Narrow iron gates crooked on their hinges, stone markers blackened with soot and time, and the heavy, cloying scent of damp earth despite the dry season. It lay sunken, as if the rest of the city had risen over the years and left this forgotten plot behind. At its heart stood the rosebush, a twisting blood-red bloom against the monochrome of stone, glistening as if freshly washed by rain. But there had been no rain. It pulsed with color. Holmes did not approach it immediately. Instead, he turned toward the constables who had cordoned off the scene and asked to see the body. Lestrade led us without ceremony behind a low line of crumbling headstones to where the corpse lay, curled slightly on one side, knees tucked, hands clasped as if in prayer. The man's face was pale and serene. He could have been sleeping, had the skin not been tinged faintly blue at the lips. He wore a well-kept wool coat and a narrow-brimmed hat had fallen beside him. One boot was untied. Holmes crouched without hesitation and examined the hands, the mouth, the edges of the nostrils. He sniffed the fingertips and brought a pocket lens close to the collar. I noted the glint of his eyes, the slight upward flick of the brows, always the surest sign that something had surprised him. "There are no signs of violence," said Lestrade. "No wound, no bruising, no blood." Holmes gave a soft hum. "And yet he is most certainly dead. May I see the note?" Lestrade produced a small evidence pouch and passed it to him. Inside was a folded square of heavy parchment, not unlike that used in fine invitations. 3 words, written in ornate copper-plate script. "Follow the bloom." Holmes turned it in his fingers. No watermark, no fold creases. This was not written in haste or carried for long. A message composed for theatrical effect, then placed here, deliberately. It has the stink of performance, Lestrade. I thought you might say that. Did you move the body at all? Number Constable found him like this at daybreak, lying just as he is. Holmes knelt again and examined the soil around the body with care, brushing it gently with his fingers. He picked up a fragment of something, barely more than a sliver, and held it toward me. "A flake of beeswax," he murmured. "Watson, take note. This man's shoes are perfectly dry and unscuffed, though the path he must have taken is thick with wet moss and sharp gravel. And look here, beneath the hem of his trousers, no trace of damp or soil. And yet, he pointed toward the grass just beyond the rose bush. There, unmistakably, were two sets of footprints, one much larger than the other. Both terminated near the bush and did not return. "He was placed here," I said. Holmes nodded. "Carried. And by someone careful not to leave a corresponding trail, at least not one detectable by the untrained eye. Which tells us two things. They were confident and they were deliberate." Lestrade's face puckered. "So you think this is murder?" "I think," said Holmes, rising to his full height, "that this is theater masquerading as death. Or death masquerading as theater. Possibly both. Watson, fetch your case and examine the body. I have a hypothesis but lack the evidence to confirm it." I did as instructed and conducted a brief examination. The pupils were dilated but responsive to light. The heart was still, the lungs had ceased movement, and the limbs were beginning to cool, though they remained flexible. Most curiously, there was no sign of rigor mortis. Not at the jaw, nor the hands, nor even the spine. This was not the rigidity of a man long dead. It was the stillness of one newly silenced. "No bruising," I reported. "No injection marks that I can find. He appears to have simply stopped." Holmes muttered something under his breath, then strode toward the rose bush. He crouched, touched a petal gently, then withdrew a handkerchief and wrapped the stem, plucking the entire bloom free and holding it close to his nose. He sniffed it once, then again, slower. Fascinating. I stepped closer. "What do you smell?" Holmes straightened. "Rose, yes, but not just rose. There's a faint undertone of laudanum, opium, and something else I cannot quite place. Metallic? Medicinal? Artificial?" He turned to Lestrade. "Have the rose analyzed, every compound, every trace element, and find out who has access to this cemetery. It cannot have been left unguarded all these years. Someone holds the keys, either literally or bureaucratically." Lestrade muttered something about red tape and wandered off to speak with the nearest constable. Holmes was already lost in thought, pacing tight circles in the grass. Then he paused. His eyes flicked toward the church ruins on the far edge of the graveyard, where a patch of ivy clung to the charred remains of a stone wall. Without a word, he made for it, motioning me to follow. As we approached, I saw what had caught his attention. There, half buried in the wall's shadow, was a spade, old but not rusted, its handle worn smooth. And beside it, pressed into the granite, was a small leather satchel. Holmes picked it up and opened it carefully. Inside were gardening shears, a tin of plant salve, and a small notebook bound in black cloth. The initials P.D. were etched in fading gold on the cover. Holmes smiled, not from pleasure, but from recognition. "Peter Drelincourt, our vanished scholar." He flipped open the notebook. The pages were filled with tight, looping script. Formulas, Latin phrases, sketches of root systems. At the top of one page, underlined twice, were the words sanguis rosa, blood rose. He passed it to me. It seems Mr. Drelincourt was not content with merely studying the language of cemetery plants. He intended to cultivate one that would speak its own terrible verse. And now he's missing. Or worse, Holmes said quietly. I looked at the dead man again. You think that's not Drelincourt? I think it may be someone who read too far into Drelincourt's ideas and decided to make them manifest. He touched the spine of the notebook thoughtfully. Watson, there's a sentence here. Listen. That which cannot grow must be nourished with silence, with stillness, with surrender. Only then will the bloom speak the truth. I frowned. What does that mean? Holmes looked toward the body. It means our victim may not yet be truly dead. And with that, he turned on his heel and strode toward the waiting cab. Come, Watson. We must speak to someone who knows the language of ancient poisons. There's a chemist in Lambeth whose shelves may hold the truth behind a rose that blooms from stone. We were scarcely settled in the hansom cab before Holmes was speaking, his voice low and rapid, his thoughts clearly a step ahead of our journey. He held the black notebook tightly in one hand, the pages fluttering in the wind from the open window, but his attention remained fixed on the ideas forming behind his eyes. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the Parsi case in Lambeth last year? The man who fell into a trance-like state after handling a supposedly cursed manuscript?" I nodded. He remained unconscious for nearly 2 days, if I recall. Indeed. But it was not superstition that felled him, but chemistry. A rare alkaloid compound derived from the Atropa belladonna and refined using mercury salts, nearly undetectable by conventional means and capable of inducing a suspended state, neither life nor death. I felt my stomach turn slightly at the thought. You believe our man in this cemetery may have been similarly afflicted? It is a possibility. His pupils, his limbs, the faint warmth still clinging to his skin, all point to a paralysis, not a final cessation. If we had buried him by nightfall, he might have awakened under stone. But to what purpose? Holmes tapped the notebook. This is not the work of a madman, Watson, or if it is a meticulous madness. The rose, the note, the condition of the body, it is all designed to provoke a reaction, to be discovered. Someone is conducting a demonstration. A demonstration of what? He turned to me then, and for a moment I saw something rare flicker across Holmes' face. Not fear exactly, but the cautious respect he reserved for adversaries worthy of his mind. Of control. Over life, over death, and over perception itself. We rode in silence after that, through the winding streets of Lambeth, past the chimneys and warehouses that belched grey plumes into the sky, until we arrived at a small, discreet shop front nestled between a pawnbroker's and a cobbler's. The sign above the door read simply, "Drebber and Company, Botanical Curiosities and Chemical Preparations." Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, vinegar, and something more metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Bottles of all shapes and sizes lined the shelves, many without labels, and strange roots curled in jars along the windowsill like specimens in a museum. A narrow man with a skull-like face and yellow-tinted spectacles emerged from behind a curtain, wiping his hands on a cloth that looked more like a relic than a rag. He regarded us with neither welcome nor suspicion, merely a kind of dispassionate curiosity. "Mr. Holmes," he said, voice thin and papery. "You come again." Holmes nodded. "Mr. Drebber, I require your opinion on a compound." Hypothetical, of course. Drebber raised an eyebrow. "As always." Holmes drew a slip of paper from his pocket and began to list compounds in Latin and Greek, some of which I recognized, others which I did not. At several, Drebber grunted softly. At one, he actually stepped back. "That combination," he said slowly, "would induce torpor so profound as to mimic death, provided the dosage were precise. Too much, and the brain ceases entirely. Too little, and consciousness remains trapped, a waking paralysis. Would the subject appear dead to a medical examiner? To a careless one, certainly. Perhaps even to a competent one without the right tests. The skin cools, the heart slows, the breath vanishes into stillness. Only the most sensitive barometer of pulse or pupil might betray the illusion." Holmes handed over the plucked rose. "Do you smell anything familiar?" Drebber took it with gloved hands, inhaled, and narrowed his eyes. "There's a trace of opiate, and something else, artificial, synthetic." He moved to a tall apparatus on the back bench and began preparing an extraction. As he worked, Holmes turned to me. There is a pattern emerging. Drelincourt's obsession was not just symbolic, it was alchemical. He sought to create a bloom that would defy both nature and expectation. Something that thrived where it should not, and in doing so, carried a message. A message for whom? For us, apparently, or for someone watching us. You see, I now believe that Drelincourt is not missing, but hiding, in plain sight or in a kind of sleep, and that someone else has taken his work and used it to make a statement. About control, I said again. Holmes nodded. Or about resurrection, about reanimating what is thought dead. Think of the implications if such a compound were perfected. The power it would grant its wielder, not just chemically, but theatrically. To feign death, to induce it, to reverse it. Drebber interrupted. Mr. Holmes. We crossed the room. He held up a small vial of translucent liquid, which shimmered faintly in the gaslight. This was extracted from your rose. It contains derivatives of opium, belladonna, digitalis, and something I've never seen. A binding agent that resists dilution. Whoever prepared this, Mr. Holmes, knew precisely what they were doing. It is not just a poison. It is a sentence. A sentence? Metaphorically, Drebber said. The body ceases function. The mind lingers. A punishment more poetic than fatal. We took our leave shortly after, and Holmes was again deep in thought as we walked the pavement outside. Then he stopped abruptly, his eyes fixed on something across the street. There, moving with carelessness through the crowd, was a figure in a grey overcoat and soft cap, carrying a satchel not unlike the one we had found in the cemetery. His gait was uneven, slightly hunched. Holmes's gaze sharpened like a blade. "Watson," he said quietly, "do you see that man?" "Yes." "Do not follow him directly. I shall take the long way round. Observe him until I return." Before I could ask why, Holmes had vanished into the crowd. I kept my eyes fixed on the figure. He paused at a corner, glanced behind once, then moved on. He did not seem aware of me, but there was a tension in his shoulders I did not like a man expecting to be pursued. He turned into an alley. I followed at a distance. When I reached the mouth of the alley, I found only the echo of retreating footsteps. And then, a sudden noise. A soft cry. I rushed forward. There, slumped against a wall, was the man's satchel. But the man himself was gone. Holmes appeared beside me a moment later, having circled back from the opposite side. "He's clever," Holmes said, "and scared. But he left us something." He opened the satchel carefully. Inside was another rose, identical to the first, but this one wrapped in vellum. Upon it, a note. "He is not dead. But if you reach him, he will be." Holmes folded the note, pocketed it, and stood. "Watson, we must act before this game moves out of our grasp. We are being warned, but also challenged. Drelincourt is alive, but someone is using him as a message. We must decipher it before the sender grows impatient." He stepped out of the alley, coat flaring behind him like the wings of a raven, and hailed a cab with a whistle. "Back to Baker Street," he called. "We must consult the records. If I'm correct, this is no longer merely a mystery. It is a performance. And the next scene begins tonight." By the time we returned to Baker Street, the sun had begun to lower behind the smoky veil of London's skyline, casting a sickly orange hue across the rooftops. Holmes, silent since our departure from Lambeth, moved with quiet urgency, shedding his coat without ceremony and going directly to the bookshelf beneath the window, where he retrieved a thin, leather-bound volume and laid it flat upon the desk. "The index," he muttered, almost to himself. That curious personal catalogue of cases, criminals, and chemical curiosities, compiled over years and kept with the reverence another man might afford a holy text, was Holmes's most treasured repository of pattern and precedent. He flipped through its pages rapidly, then stopped and tapped a line near the bottom of a folio marked R. "Here it is. Watson, read this." I leaned over. The entry read, "Raskin Theophilus, alias Arbogast, alias Vireo, amateur." pharmacologist, expelled from the Royal College for unethical experiments with induced coma states, obsession with botanical manipulation, and theatrical illusion. Last known address, Scion Hill Asylum, discharged under unknown circumstances, 1889. Holmes's face was taut with anticipation. "I had not thought of Raskin in years," he said. "He was clever, a failed genius in the purest sense. What he lacked in restraint, he made up for in spectacle. His paper on conscious stasis was laughed out of Edinburgh, but I recall the structure of his argument was dangerously elegant. Like all theatrical minds, he hungered not for applause, but awe." "And you think he's behind this?" Holmes stood and paced. "He's certainly behind the idea of it. Whether it is Raskin himself or a disciple is unclear, but the rose, the body, the note, they echo his methods precisely. A mystery designed not to conceal but to draw attention, a performance that becomes more elaborate with every scene." He tapped the notebook again, his finger resting on the phrase sanguis rosa. "This is not a clue, Watson. It is an invocation." I sat across from him, mind racing to catch up with the breadth of his speculation. "But to what end? What does the perpetrator want us to do?" "To watch," Holmes said softly. "To see what he has created, and perhaps to acknowledge it. What disturbs me is not that he left a message, but that he left us the means to trace it." Before I could respond, a sharp knock came at the door. It was unhurried, 3 firm taps, as if from someone quite certain they would be received. Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual flustered courtesy. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He wouldn't give his name. Said only that you'd understand." Holmes tilted his head. "Show him up." A moment later, the visitor appeared in the doorway. He was slight, bird-like in stature, with a thin moustache and spectacles that seemed slightly too large for his narrow face. He wore a velvet jacket and carried a hat with hands that trembled faintly. Yet there was something oddly fixed in his gaze, something that seemed not quite present. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice high and steady, "I have reason to believe I'm being followed, and I suspect it may be myself." Holmes gestured to the settee. "Please, sir, begin at the beginning." The man seated himself, adjusting his cuffs with great care. "My name is Rafe Collings. I am, or was, a student of Peter Drelincourt. I assisted him in transcribing several of his unpublished treatises, mostly on the symbolic encoding of plants in funerary rites. He spoke often of the sanguis rosa, not just as myth, but as a potential reality, a bloom that only flowered in silence and shadow. I thought it metaphor until a fortnight ago when he began receiving packages." "What kind of packages?" Holmes asked. "Vials, dried roots, inkless manuscripts that appeared to have been written in invisible ink." He was thrilled, and then afraid. He said someone was testing him, or testing the rose, that it was no longer his. Holmes's expression sharpened. "And what did you do?" "I left. I told him it was nonsense. I regret that now." Holmes folded his hands. "What do you mean when you say you're being followed by yourself?" Collings' lips tightened. "I mean that 3 nights ago I saw someone standing outside my building, not just watching, mirroring. Same hat, same coat, same limp. I moved left. He did too. When I crossed the street, he did not follow, but his eyes did. I went home and locked the door. And this morning, someone left this on my windowsill." He reached into his coat and produced a single crimson rose, identical to the others. This one, however, had a pin stuck through the stem, and dangling from the pin was a scrap of black ribbon. Holmes took it carefully. Theatrical indeed. And then I saw a man following me again, this time from the omnibus. I ran. I remembered Drelincourt speaking of you, and I came here. Holmes nodded once, then turned to me. "Watson, fetch my files on symbolic impersonation, and bring the map of Greater London. As I moved to comply, he turned back to Collins. "This man you saw, this mirror, did he ever speak?" "No." "Did you ever see his face?" Number 8 was in shadow, but I felt that it was mine. Holmes pressed the rose flat between blotter paper and stood. "We must go to Drelincourt's residence. At once. Something is unfolding. Meticulously timed, meticulously built. If my suspicion is correct, there is not just a message, but a destination, and we are being pushed toward it step by step." "But to what purpose?" I asked again, helplessly. "To bring us into the garden," Holmes said. "And once there, to show us what has been growing in the dark." We set off at once, with Collins in tow, his pale hands twisting his hat as we rode through the dusky London streets toward Holloway. The sky had deepened into a velvet grey, and a chill had settled into the air, the kind that raised the hairs at the nape of the neck, not from temperature, but anticipation. Drelincourt's house was a narrow brick structure tucked between two larger homes, each shuttered and silent. There was something oddly theatrical about it, as if the house itself had been placed there for effect. Holmes knocked once, then again, and then tried the door. It opened with a soft groan. Inside, the air was stale and tinged with something faintly medicinal. The sitting room was in disarray. Papers strewn, books pulled from shelves, a single chair turned toward the window, but there was no sign of a struggle. Holmes moved through the rooms with careful precision, his eyes alert. In the bedroom, he paused before a writing desk. Upon it sat a single page, laid out as if awaiting a reader. It was handwritten. Drelincourt's looping script. "You have seen the bloom. Now see the seed. Beneath what is buried, he waits." Holmes exhaled slowly. "He's beneath something, or someone is." Collins hovered behind us. "He used to speak of a cellar, but I never saw one." Holmes turned. "Then it's time we found it. If he's still alive, he may not remain so much longer, and if he is not, then what lies below may be even more significant." He retrieved a lantern from the wall, lit it with a match, and turned toward the hallway's far end. "Watson, Collins, follow closely. I believe the next scene is about to begin." The lantern cast long, shivering shadows across the narrow corridor as Holmes led the way, his movements unhurried but precise, the flame in his hand flickering with each measured step. The hallway sloped subtly downward, the walls narrowing as if the house itself were drawing us inward toward a throat of silence. Behind me, Collins clutched his coat collar with white-knuckled fingers. I could hear the catch in his breath every time a floorboard creaked beneath us. At the end of the passage, Holmes stopped before a low wooden door nearly obscured by an old tapestry of faded rose patterns. He pulled it aside and examined the frame with his lens, brushing dust from a seam just above the handle. There, faint but unmistakable, was the residue of disturbed powder, chalk perhaps, or fine brick dust, clinging to the edges of the wood as though the door had been opened recently, but not often. "Stand back," he said softly. With a gentle push, the door swung inward, revealing a steep stone stair spiraling into darkness. The air that rose to meet us was colder than I expected, tinged with iron and mildew, and something else beneath it, something dry, perfumed, almost floral. Holmes descended first, holding the lantern low. I followed, the walls tightening around us with every step, until the stairs gave way to a vaulted cellar of brick and old stone. It was no more than 20 feet square, the ceiling low and arched, with shelves running along the far wall lined with glass jars and leather-bound volumes. But it was not the books or jars that drew the eye. It was the table at the center of the room. A long oak slab, worn smooth at the edges, upon which lay the unmistakable outline of a man beneath a sheer linen sheet. A single candle burned near his head, illuminating his still features in a trembling golden light. Holmes crossed swiftly and pulled back the cloth with the delicacy of a surgeon. It was Drelincourt. Though his hair was now streaked with white and the skin about his temples had drawn tight against the bone, there was no mistaking the delicate scholar's features, the high brow, the narrow jaw, the long tapering fingers. He lay motionless, eyes closed, lips parted slightly as though on the cusp of a breath. But none came. Beside him, on a small stand, rested an open notebook, nearly filled. Holmes picked it up and turned the pages slowly, his expression darkening with each one. "This is not a death," he murmured. "It's a confession." I moved to the table and touched Drelincourt's wrist. Cool, no pulse. Yet the skin retained its elasticity, no sign of true decay. I unfastened his shirt slightly, pressed my stethoscope to the chest, and listened. Nothing. Then, faintly, on the second listen, a whisper of sound. Not a beat, not a breath, but the faintest vibration, a flutter deep in the tissues. I drew back sharply. "He's alive." Holmes nodded without surprise. Suspended. Preserved. As he meant to be. Collings took a hesitant step forward, his eyes wide. But why would he do this to himself? Holmes didn't answer at once. Instead, he handed me the final page of the journal. The writing was tighter there, more frantic. The formula must silence the mind before it stills the body. In that silence, the bloom speaks. The rose grows where it ought not. Because death is not the end, only the soil. If you find me, know that I consented. But beware. The others do not share my caution. Holmes turned to me, his tone suddenly sharp. "We must revive him. Tonight, we cannot wait. He is the only person who knows who has taken this beyond the theoretical." I hesitated. "Holmes, we don't know what he took, how long he's been like this. Even if I can stimulate circulation, he may not come back whole. His mind could fracture. He would rather wake broken than let this bloom fester in someone else's hands." I examined the nearby shelves quickly. Dozens of vials, marked in Drelincourt's hand, some familiar, others unreadable. Finally, I found a sealed ampule marked Antiplus/Emergo. My Latin was rusty, but the implication was clear. "This must be it," I said. Holmes nodded once. "Do it." With the utmost care, I drew the compound into a syringe and injected it into the vein at Drelincourt's neck. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a tremor passed through his hand, a twitch of the fingers, a shallow gasp. His chest rose once, fell, rose again. His eyes opened. They did not focus at first. He blinked once, twice, then stared straight upward. His voice, when it came, was little more than air. "Not the rose, the root." Holmes leaned over him. "Mr. Drelincourt, can you hear me?" "The root," he repeated. "They took the root. I showed them the bloom, but they needed the root to bind it. I thought it was still theory, until they tested it." "Who?" Holmes asked urgently. "Who is they?" But Drelincourt's eyes rolled back and he began to seize, his limbs twitching uncontrollably. I held him fast, trying to protect his head, but the convulsions passed almost as soon as they began. He slumped again into unconsciousness, the muscles of his face slack. "He'll live," I said. "But I doubt we'll get anything more from him tonight." Holmes stood very still. "Then the performance continues without its author." He turned back to the shelves and began searching quickly, methodically. After a minute, he produced a long, narrow box and opened it. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a shriveled, gnarled object, half root, half tuber, roughly the length of a man's palm. It was dark as dried blood and coiled in on itself like a clenched fist. "This," Holmes said, "is the root he spoke of." Collings backed away instinctively. "What is it?" "I don't know, but it is no natural specimen. It has been shaped, grafted, cultivated for purpose. There is power in this. Symbolic or chemical, I cannot yet say." He closed the box and tucked it into his coat. "We must get Drelincourt to a safe place, and we must prepare for what comes next, because if they took this route, if they plan to use it, then this entire affair is about to escalate." He extinguished the lantern, leaving only the candle to cast its glow on the sleeping figure. We carried Drelincourt carefully up the stairs and into the fading night, the house behind us as silent as a crypt. Only as we reached the cab did I realize my hands were shaking. "Holmes," I said quietly, "what do you think they're trying to grow?" He looked at me, his eyes colder than I had seen them in weeks. "A soul," he said, "or something that can wear one like a mask." We returned to Baker Street well past midnight, the city cloaked in a damp stillness broken only by the occasional clatter of distant hooves or the sigh of a gas lamp guttering in its cage. Holmes had not spoken during the entire ride. His fingers tapped lightly against the velvet box in his coat pocket, and I knew that the rhythm meant his mind was balancing on the edge of several conclusions, none of which pleased him. Drelincourt lay stretched on the settee, wrapped in a blanket, his pulse steady now but shallow, his breathing barely audible. I had administered a sedative to prevent further seizures, but the damage of his long artificial slumber would not be so easily undone. He murmured from time to time, fragments of Latin, names I did not recognize, and occasionally the word mirror, always whispered with the dread of a man who feared not being watched, but being reflected. Holmes busied himself immediately upon our return, clearing the center table and arranging an array of reference materials with surgical precision. He retrieved the root from its box and placed it upon a linen cloth beneath the lamplight, then sat cross-legged before it like a scholar before a forbidden manuscript. I kept one eye on Drelincourt and the other on Holmes, knowing better than to speak until he did. Finally, he broke the silence. "Watson, in all your experience as a physician, have you ever encountered a substance capable of inducing a mental echo?" I frowned. "Define mental echo." "A residue," he said. "Not memory, but mimicry. A lingering of identity, conscious or not, that can be transferred from one body to another. Not possession, but replication. Number that borders on the mystical." He nodded, unsurprised. "And yet it is the implication here. Drelincourt's writing hints at a root that carries not merely pharmacological potency, but symbolic identity. A root that, when paired with the right rituals and preparations, can allow one to mirror another, to become, at least to the eye and voice and manner, indistinguishable. You think someone is impersonating him. I think someone is impersonating someone. Collings was followed by himself. Drelincourt saw the rose grow from stone. We have stumbled into a theatre of reflections, Watson, one in which the players are no longer content to wear masks. They wish to be the thing they mimic. The idea unsettled me more than I cared to admit. "So, what do we do now?" Holmes reached for his violin and began to tune it softly, the strings wailing with a tension that mirrored the heaviness of the hour. We bait the reflection. He turned to me, face calm but voice edged with resolve. The man who left the second rose, the one we saw in Lambeth, was not random. He was watching Drelincourt's trail. He led us to the alley, then disappeared, which means he wants to be seen. Or rather, he wants us to follow. "And you intend to give him the chance?" "Yes," Holmes said, "but on our terms." Over the next hour, Holmes composed a note, signed with the initials P.D. and carefully written in the same looping hand as Drelincourt's journal. It read, "The root has flowered. Meet me where the stone last bled. Midnight. Come alone." He folded it, pressed a sliver of the root into the crease, and sealed it with black wax. "This," he said, "we leave where he can find it." And so it was, just before dawn, that we stood once again at the edge of Greyfriars Close, the iron gate groaning as we eased it open. Holmes moved without hesitation to the center of the graveyard, where the rose bush still bloomed crimson against the granite. He knelt, placed the note within the leaves, and withdrew. "I give it until nightfall," he said as we turned back to the street. "If we are correct, he will come, and he will come as someone we know." The day passed in quiet tension. Holmes barely moved from his chair, his gaze distant, his hands folded beneath his chin. I wrote up my notes on Drelincourt's revival and sent them in confidence to a medical colleague under the pretense of seeking guidance on obscure toxins. Collings remained pale and silent, occasionally rising to peer out the window with a mixture of paranoia and hope. Drelincourt, mercifully, slept. Night fell like a curtain. Holmes dressed in dark grays and concealed his features beneath a narrow-brimmed hat and scarf. I followed suit. We took no weapons. Holmes's instructions were clear. He will not come if he smells a trap. We must let him believe we are unarmed and unprepared. Only then will he attempt the mirror. We arrived at Greyfriars at 10 minutes to midnight and took up position behind the crumbling church wall just beyond the line of sight to the rosebush. The mist had returned, thick now and low, curling around the gravestones like smoke from some deeper fire. All was silence, save for the faint ticking of Holmes's pocket watch. Then, a shape. A figure stepped slowly through the cemetery gate. Same height as Holmes, same coat, same lean profile. I saw him in silhouette only, but even from a distance, my breath caught. The gait, the angle of the head, the subtle roll of the shoulder as he paused to scan the stones. He walked directly to the rosebush and stopped. He bent, reached into the leaves and retrieved the note. Unfolded it. Read. Then, without warning, he turned and looked directly at our hiding place. Holmes did not flinch. He rose from the shadows and stepped forward. The figure did not run. They approached each other slowly, two shadows converging in a field of stone. When they met, I stepped from my place as well, heart pounding. The stranger raised his head. I gasped aloud. It was Holmes. Every line, every angle, every flicker of expression, down to the subtle furrow between the brows when he was half concentrating, half suspicious. It was not just resemblance. It was identical. The two Holmeses stood inches apart, eyeing one another in a silence so profound it felt louder than speech. Then the real Holmes spoke. "You have borrowed my face," he said coldly. "You would do better to borrow my mind." The other smiled. Holmes's smile, but slower, hungrier. "I have no need for your mind," he said. "Only your name." Holmes did not look away. "Why?" "To become permanent," the figure said. "I was grown, not born. I am what the rose makes possible. I am the perfected echo." "You are a counterfeit," Holmes said. "Aren't we all?" the figure asked softly. Then, without warning, he lunged. Holmes was ready. The struggle was brief and precise, like watching two dancers rehearsing the same violent choreography. But in the end, Holmes struck the impostor across the temple with a sudden upward jab of the palm. The man collapsed into the grass, unmoving. Holmes stood over him, panting once, then kneeling. "Watson, come quickly." I hurried over and knelt as Holmes turned the man onto his side. His skin had begun to pale, to tremble. No longer in control, his eyes fluttered and unfocused. "He's unraveling," Holmes said. "The echo is breaking." Indeed, the man's features had begun to shift, not grotesquely but subtly, like wet clay losing the shape of the mold. Holmes pulled something from the man's coat, another velvet-lined case. Inside was a second root, smaller, more refined, pulsing faintly with reddish veins. "We end it here," Holmes said, snapping the box shut. "No more mirrors." And, together, we left the field of stone, the impostor behind us, fading into mist as surely as the roses would by dawn. We returned to Baker Street as the first pale hints of dawn seeped into the city's smoky veil, and for the first time in days, Holmes looked older. Not tired. Holmes did not admit to fatigue in any ordinary sense, but waited, as though the encounter at Greyfriars had introduced something into the fibers of his mind he could not simply file away, something that disturbed the boundaries he had spent a lifetime mapping with such precision. The duplicate was gone. Lestrade and his men, arriving only minutes after we departed, found no body. No footprints, not even the box Holmes had confiscated, as if the earth itself had closed around the counterfeit and drawn it back into the deep roots from which it had been coaxed. Holmes had not spoken a word since we left the cemetery. Now, in the soft hush of our sitting room, he removed the sealed case from his coat and placed it on the table with great care. Drelincourt still slept, his features more relaxed now, as though some invisible tension had loosened in the night. Collings, hunched in the corner, watched Holmes with wary eyes. The poor man had said little since witnessing the impostor. I doubted he would say much for some time. Holmes stared at the second route in silence for nearly a full minute. Then, with a soft exhale, he turned and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. From within it, he withdrew a glass jar half filled with a viscous, clear liquid, its label marked with nothing but a single Greek symbol, theta. He opened the root's case and, with tongs, lowered the specimen into the fluid. It hissed faintly, and small bubbles rose to the surface, as if the thing were breathing its last. "Destroyed?" I asked. "Contained," Holmes replied. "Nothing grown with such intention should be left exposed to light or air. The compound in this jar halts decay and activity." He replaced the lid and sealed the jar with wax. "There were two," I said quietly. "The original root and this refined copy. Do you believe there are more?" "I do," he said, "though how many and in whose hands is unknown. But I believe we were meant to stop this one, that it was allowed to grow precisely so we would come to cut it down." He turned from the jar and looked at me with a strange intensity. "Watson, you asked before what they were trying to grow. I no longer believe it is just identity or mimicry. I believe they are trying to grow permanence, a version of a man, not just copied, but improved, free from origin, history, or moral complication." "And you think it began with Drelincourt?" "He cultivated the philosophy. Someone else weaponized it. Someone saw the rose not as a symbol, but as a tool." He glanced over at the sleeping Drelincourt, and I suspect he knows who. As if summoned by those words, the old scholar stirred. He shifted beneath the blanket, groaned softly, and opened his eyes. They were clearer now, wary, still weighted with fatigue, but unmistakably conscious. Holmes was at his side in an instant. "Mr. Drelincourt," he said gently, "you are safe. You are in my rooms at Baker Street. You have been asleep for some time." Drelincourt blinked. "How long?" "5 days. Perhaps longer if one includes the preparation." The old man's fingers gripped the blanket. "The root. Did it find a host?" Holmes nodded. "2 that we know of. One attempted to replace me. We stopped it." Drelincourt closed his eyes. "There will be others." The garden was not grown in secret. There was a circle. 5 of us in the beginning. One by one they abandoned theory. Chose practice. I warned them. I said the rose must not be planted in the flesh. Holmes leaned in. "Give me names." The old man hesitated, then spoke in a voice barely audible. "Ferren, for certain. He was the first to attempt it. He vanished after claiming to have found a root of duality beneath an ossuary in Milan. Then there was Caro, always fascinated by masks, by ritual. He believed memory was merely a pattern to be impressed, like a seal in wax. But the one you must fear most is Altham. Tobias Altham. He had no past of his own and so sought to steal others." Holmes repeated the name softly. "Tobias Altham. He believed the rose was a lens," Drelincourt continued, "and the root a reservoir, That if one could distill the qualities of a man, not merely his words or habits, but the shape of his will, one could pour that into another vessel, and the new man would not know he was not original. A perfect forgery, Holmes murmured. Number worse, Drelincourt said. A perfect heir, a being that believes itself real, one that could act without guilt, without memory of its theft, a man with no shadow. He began to tremble. Holmes placed a hand gently on his shoulder. I will stop him, he said. Tell me where he is. I don't know. He kept moving. He had patrons, aristocrats with old debts. He traveled through libraries no longer indexed, spoke in societies that do not publish their proceedings. The last I heard. He was in Norfolk, near the coast, something about the salt preserving the seed. Holmes nodded. That is enough. He rose and crossed to the window, folding his arms, staring into the weak morning light as if trying to pierce the fog. I shall go, he said at last. Altham is no longer content to create. He wishes to replace, and he has had time to perfect his formula, which means he has not just a route, but a plan. I stepped beside him. I'm coming with you. He smiled faintly. Of course, if I'm to face myself again, I would prefer to have someone who knows the original. We left Baker Street that afternoon under a heavy grey sky. Drelincourt remained in our care, tended by Collings who, having seen the mirror once, no longer questioned its existence. Holmes sent a note ahead to Lestrade, couched in cryptic phrasing, informing him to expect further developments of an unusual nature. As we boarded the train to Norfolk, I glanced once more at Holmes. His eyes were distant, trained not on the passing fields, but on something internal, a battle forming not only with an enemy in the world, but with the implications of what that enemy represented. You believe Altham means to replace someone of importance, I said. I do, he replied. And I believe the first experiment was meant to prove that it could be done, even to a man like me. I hesitated, then asked, and if it had succeeded? He looked at me, then truly looked, and his voice was as quiet as the train's soft motion over the tracks. Then I would be the one sitting beside you now, and neither of us would know. The train pressed on into the east, toward the sea, toward the garden yet unseen, where something not quite human was already waiting to bloom. The train rocked gently as it wound through the empty stretches of moor and marshland, the countryside beyond our window gradually flattening into the bleak, wind-bitten openness that marked the Norfolk coast. Holmes sat motionless beside me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze unfocused, not asleep, never that, but turned inward as though his thoughts were arranging themselves into a pattern only he could discern. I did not interrupt. I had long since learned that his silences were not pauses in thought, but the very act of thinking itself, as essential to him as breath. We arrived just after dusk at a station that barely deserved the name. A single platform, a shuttered ticket booth, and a path that led through a sparse copse of pines toward the village of Halversham. It was not marked on most maps. The air here had a raw salt edge, sharp as a blade, and the gulls overhead called not with joy, but with a kind of warning. Holmes sniffed once and said only, "We're close." We found a pair of rooms at the village's only inn. A grey bricked house slouched at the edge of a crumbling bluff, its shutters trembling faintly from the wind even when closed. The proprietor, a bent woman with hands like driftwood, watched Holmes with something between suspicion and reverence, as though she recognized him not by name, but by archetype. When he inquired about a Tobias Altham, she shook her head slowly but did not look surprised. "There's no one here by that name," she said. "But the old estate just east of here, Greywit Hall, has had a visitor. Man alone, been there 3 weeks now. Keeps to himself." "Does he take deliveries?" "Twice a week. Boxes, sealed tight, and a gardener. Young lad. Doesn't speak much." Holmes inclined his head politely. "Thank you." As we climbed the narrow staircase to our rooms, I leaned close. Greywit? Holmes nodded. It was once owned by the Ferncombe family, long extinct. The property has passed hand to hand through eccentric heirs and pseudonymous trusts. Drellincourt's mention of patrons now makes more sense. A house that disappears into private ownership every 2 years is the perfect soil for a hidden garden. We ate little that evening. Holmes consumed only a cup of broth and a crust of bread, refusing brandy with a shake of the head. At midnight, we set out on foot, the moon rising in a bone-white arc over the moors. The path to Greywit Hall wound along the edge of a marsh, and each step on the narrow trail sent a subtle shudder through the reeds. Holmes moved swiftly, his coat close about him, his eyes scanning ahead with an intensity that made me feel as though we were already trespassing in someone's dream. Greywit revealed itself not in silhouette, but in silence. It did not loom. It waited. The house stood behind a low stone wall, its windows dark, its facade mottled by age and creeping moss. But the garden, it was the garden that caught the breath. Behind the house stretched rows upon rows of hedges, meticulously pruned, curling in labyrinthine spirals. And between them, impossible even by moonlight, bloomed a lattice of roses so deep in color they appeared black. They did not sway with the wind. They pulsed, barely perceptible, yet unmistakable, alive in a manner that made the skin itch. Holmes crouched just beyond the gate, scanning the house and garden with a small brass field glass. "There," he murmured. "Greenhouse. Rear of the estate. See the venting along the roofline?" I nodded. "That is where it's prepared. The mimicry does not begin in the mind, Watson. It begins in the breath, inhaled, absorbed, distilled into the blood. The scent is the primer." "And the root?" I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "The root is the key. The scent opens the door. The root steps through it." We waited another hour, watching until a figure emerged from the rear of the house. He carried a lantern, shielding it from the wind, and made his way toward the greenhouse. He moved with the precision of someone who had walked this path many times, neither hurried nor slow, but measured. When he turned to unlock the glass door, the light caught his profile. My breath caught. It was Holmes. No variation, no flaw. Even the curl of the collar was identical. Holmes beside me went still as stone. "We move now," he said. We crossed the field in silence, ducking low beneath the hedge line, and approached the greenhouse from the far side. The structure was large, nearly 30 feet long, with old iron frames and panes of glass that had been cleaned with obsessive care. Inside, under a white glow of alchemical lamps, were rows of tables. Each bore a glass cylinder not unlike a coffin, and within each, suspended in fluid or laid upon silk, were bodies, some incomplete, some clearly deceased. But one, near the center, sat upright, breathing. Holmes slipped through the side door as the duplicate Holmes continued his work at a bench, his back turned. The real Holmes gestured for me to wait by the door. He stepped into the light. The duplicate turned at once. No surprise registered. He merely observed. "So," said the copy, "the original returns." Holmes tilted his head. "Tell me, are you conscious of what you are? Or do you merely echo me?" The man smiled. "You always were insufferably curious." Holmes did not blink. "Then you are Altham." "Not quite." The figure walked toward him with deliberate steps. "Altham has gone beyond names. I am a bloom of his design. You see, detective, you are admired, even by those who seek to replace you, but admiration is not worship. It is envy in a finer coat." Holmes glanced at the upright figure in the tank. "Who is that?" "My heir," said the double. "He will replace the man who replaces you." Holmes moved fast, a single step, and he swept the nearby lantern off the bench, shattering it across the floor. Fire leapt to life in an instant, consuming the scattered chemicals. The copy reeled back, his face lit with sudden fear, an expression that had no mirror in Holmes's own. I sprang forward to join the fray. Holmes struck first, sending the man tumbling into the glass of a cultivation tank. A bloom of red, not rose, but blood, spread along the pane. The body slumped. Holmes was already pulling the upright figure from the cylinder, gasping, dazed, but alive. "We go," he said. "Now." We escaped into the night as flames consumed the greenhouse, its roses shriveling in unnatural screams of scent and smoke. The house beyond it was already alight when we reached the gate, and by the time the sun crested the sea horizon, Greywit Hall was ash. Back in London, the man we had saved remained nameless, his face familiar, yet blank. Drelincourt examined him for days but could find no memory, no identity, only reflexes and tone, a shell grown to hold someone else's future. Holmes sat long by the window that week, violin untouched, pipe forgotten. "What disturbs me, Watson," he said finally, "is not that they tried to replicate me. It is that they succeeded, until I asked who he was. He had no answer, and yet he smiled. I said nothing, because I too had seen that smile, and part of me feared we had not burned the garden to the ground, only pruned it. In the days that followed our return to London, there was an unusual hush in Baker Street, not a silence born of calm, but a strained stillness, like a room holding its breath after something sacred has been disturbed. Holmes paced only sparingly. His violin sat untouched in its case. He spent long hours in the deep armchair facing the fire, not reading, not writing, but staring into the flames with the grim contemplation of a man who has glimpsed the shape of something he cannot yet name. The strange figure we had rescued, the heir, as the duplicate Holmes had called him, remained under the watch of Drelincourt and Collings, both of whom had temporarily taken residence in the rear rooms of the building at Holmes's insistence. The man, or construct, or echo, was docile, quiet, and unnervingly attentive. He did not speak, but he listened with such focus that one almost felt the weight of his silence like a question waiting to be answered. He mimicked movements with uncanny precision. When Collings coughed, the man coughed faintly half a minute later. When Drelincourt dropped a teacup by accident, the man blinked and his hand twitched. The resemblance to a child learning the mechanics of personhood was difficult to ignore, but Holmes had forbidden any direct tests. "He is not a specimen," he said. "He is evidence, and perhaps a warning." On the third morning, a letter arrived, hand-delivered with no return address. The envelope was pressed with an unfamiliar seal, an archaic design, a rose wound around a flame. Holmes turned it over twice before opening it with his pocket knife. I watched his face carefully as he read, his brow furrowed once. Then again, but he made no sound. When he passed the letter to me, his voice was low. We were not the only audience. The paper bore a single paragraph, written in a calligraphic hand. "You have proven your originality, Mr. Holmes, and preserved your primacy. For now. But every system rejects its shadow only once. The next will not be a mirror. The next will be a mask. And masks, as you know, are made to be worn. No signature, no trace of ink composition or watermark." Holmes's fingers trembled faintly as he turned it back and forth under the gas lamp. Then he exhaled. "It's begun again." I struggled to keep the unease from my voice. "This wasn't Altham. Number, this is a different pen entirely. The syntax lacks Altham's self-importance. It's colder, structured, which suggests this new writer is not an ideologue. He or she is a planner. Then the network's larger than we knew." "Not larger," Holmes said. "Deeper. The root has branches, Watson. We burned a bloom, but the hand that cultivated it remains unseen. He walked to the shelf and retrieved the sealed jar containing the second root, the one taken from the impostor in Greyfriars Close. It had darkened in the solution, and the faint vein-like structures within had faded. But it had not decayed. Holmes held it at eye level. This, whatever this is, was not designed to perish. It was designed to wait. We have no idea how many more are stored, hidden, buried, or, worse, already planted. His eyes narrowed. We must trace the pattern, Watson. Not the men who wear the masks, but the ones who distribute them, the ones who design the garden. He retrieved Drelincourt's notebook from the desk and laid it open across several pages. Symbols, names, sketches. Many of them I had seen before, but one, repeated in the margins, barely noticeable, had gone undiscussed until now. "Do you recognize this?" Holmes asked, tapping the symbol, a closed eye surrounded by thorns. I shook my head. Nor did I, until last night. It appears in a number of suppressed monographs on ritualistic mimesis, the cult of the parhelion, the obscured self-movement, groups obsessed not with imitation, but with the erasure of origin, the act of becoming by replacing. A cult? Not in the usual sense. No robes, no chants, no temples. They are scholars, aristocrats, chemists, playwrights, scattered, but unified by one guiding principle. That identity is obsolete. That permanence can be engineered, and history rewritten by the act of replication. He shut the notebook. "And the closed eye?" I asked. "Symbolizes the original's consent, the moment the true self ceases to observe. It is not the death of the body that allows replacement. It is the death of recognition." I felt a chill creep into my spine. "And you think they've already succeeded?" Holmes didn't answer. He reached instead for a folder he had kept sealed since our return from Norfolk. Inside were a series of notes, newspaper clippings and telegrams, all marked in Holmes's tight script. "Observe," he said, laying them out. "A clerk in Whitehall who vanished for 2 weeks and returned with no memory of his absence, but with fluency in Latin and an altered gait. A bishop in Bath who no longer recognizes his own sermons. A pianist in Brighton who plays with her left hand only, though all prior records show she was exclusively right-handed. Small things, but together. They echo," I murmured. Holmes nodded. Small imperfections in the replication. They may not even know they are altered, but the trace remains, and so we catalogue the fractures. He tapped his pen against the rose seal letter. "Whoever wrote this knows we've begun to see the cracks, and they are warning us not to look further." "Then we look further," I said. Holmes turned and regarded me with an expression I had rarely seen, one not of determination, but of worry. "Watson," he said, "there may come a moment when you must choose between the Holmes you know and one who wears my face. And if that moment comes, you must not hesitate." I said nothing for a long moment. Then, slowly, I opened the drawer of the side table, retrieved the revolver I kept there, and placed it between us on the table. "I've followed you through fog, fire, and madness," I said. "If one of you raises a hand against the other, I'll know the difference, even if you don't." Holmes gave the faintest smile. "That is precisely why I trust you." We sat then, the two of us, in the growing dark, surrounded by the crackling of the fire and the faint sound of breathing from the next room. The breathing of a man who had not been born, but sculpted. A man who might someday believe he was someone else entirely. And outside, beyond Baker Street, London turned in its restless sleep, unaware that its mirrors were no longer just for reflection. Some were now doors, and others wounds. The following morning dawned colourless and reluctant, the sky over London pressed low and grey as though reluctant to reveal what had changed in the world below. Holmes was up before me. I found him not at his usual station by the window, nor in the chair by the fire, but standing at the mirror above the fireplace, gazing at his own reflection as though it were a stranger he was trying to place. He didn't acknowledge me at first. Only after a full minute did he turn, slowly, with a peculiar expression, less troubled than suspended, as if he were waiting for something inside himself to speak before he could. "I've begun to question whether recognition is a stable phenomenon," he said. "Not of others, but of the self." I reached for the kettle, half hoping a cup of tea might restore some normalcy. That's a dangerous line of thinking for a man whose profession depends on certainty. Holmes didn't smile. Certainty is the illusion that keeps reason from madness. But when the illusion begins to fray, even reason is no safe harbor. I poured him a cup without asking and handed it over. He took it absently, sat, and opened the folded newspaper on the table. But not for news. He flipped directly to the obituary column. "There," he said, tapping the page. I leaned in. A small notice. Sir Lionel Marsh, retired ambassador, passed peacefully at his London home, known for his contributions to East African trade relations and his patronage of botanical societies. I raised an eyebrow. He was one of Drelincourt's backers. Holmes nodded. "Mentioned once in a letter, long ago. An admirer of symbolic vegetation," Drelincourt said. "A sponsor of minor cultic symposia. His death is not suspicious in itself, but the timing is. The obituary only says he died peacefully." "Yes," Holmes said. "And yet I saw him yesterday morning at the Royal Society's reading room. Or someone who wore his face." My breath hitched faintly. "Are you sure?" "I'm certain of the gait. The left limp, the way he stroked his chin when thinking. The face? It was blurred, under a wide-brimmed hat. But it was him. Or an echo." I sat slowly. "Then we're too late." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Or just in time. If the garden of reflections is blooming again, its gardeners must move in haste. The more they succeed, the more reckless they become." He reached across the table and pulled a thin stack of telegrams from beneath the paper. I had inquiries sent across the continent, discreet channels, every known associate of Altham or Drelincourt. Most are scattered, but one name recurred in whispers. A man known only as Virex. A pseudonym, obviously. I had never heard the name. "What's he done?" "Nothing, publicly. But he appears at the periphery of every known rupture. A lecture in Dresden that ended with a scholar losing his memory. A gallery in Prague whose owner no longer recognizes her own paintings. A private dinner in Paris after which 3 guests claim to be each other. He never speaks, never signs. But the symbol, the closed eye surrounded by thorns, appears on his calling cards. Do we know where he is now?" Holmes drew a single card from the telegram bundle and laid it flat. A London address, Fitzrovia, a private club, unmarked. The kind of place that had neither hours nor windows. "I believe," Holmes said softly, "that the garden has found fertile soil here in the city, and that Virex is cultivating it under our very feet." I stood. "When do we go?" Holmes rose as well, but his hand closed around my wrist with unusual force. "Watson, if what waits there has moved beyond mimicry, if it has learned adaptation, then we may be walking into a room that knows us better than we know ourselves." "Then we confront it before it grows bolder," I said, "or deeper." We left shortly before noon, dressed plainly, unarmed, save for the revolver in my pocket and Holmes's hidden blade tucked behind the cuff of his left wrist. Fitzrovia that day was quiet, cloaked in an afternoon fog that softened the shapes of buildings and people alike. The address led us to a curved iron gate on a side street barely wider than an alley. A knocker shaped like a rose stem coiled into a fist jutted from the center of the black door. Holmes touched it, hesitated, and then knocked once. No sound from within. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. The interior was dim, lit only by soft gas sconces along a velvet-lined corridor. We stepped inside, and the door closed behind us without touch. It was silent. Not the silence of emptiness, but of attention. We moved forward. The corridor branched left, then right, then descended in a spiral that felt deeper than it was. Finally, it opened into a wide chamber, octagonal, each wall paneled with tall mirrors. At its center stood a single chair, facing the farthest wall. In the chair sat a man, tall, composed. Back to us. Holmes stepped forward. "Virex," he said. The man did not turn. "You've mimicked the structure of performance," Holmes continued, "but not its soul. A trick is not a transformation. What are you?" The man stood. When he turned, I felt my breath catch. It was Holmes. Not a duplicate, not a counterfeit, but an idolized Holmes. Sharper, smoother, the cheekbones slightly more refined, the eyes more vivid. He wore Holmes's face as an artist might render a portrait, correcting the asymmetry of nature into something too perfect. The thing smiled. "I am what you leave behind when you forget yourself." Holmes did not move. I am the Holmes that acts without hesitation, the Holmes who sees through every veil without pity, who knows the end and chooses it before the game begins. "You are hollow," Holmes said. "No," the thing replied. "I am distilled." It took a step forward. I raised my revolver. Holmes raised a hand, not to me, but to the mirrors. "Then show your reflection." And the mirrors lit, but none showed the idealized figure. They showed us, Holmes and me, but in different postures, slight changes, 1,000 decisions unmade, 1,000 selves. The room was a gallery of our own divergence, and the thing watched it all. "You see," it said, "the self is not fixed. It is a garden of shadows. I simply chose one to become real." Holmes stared at it and then stepped forward. "And that is why you fail." He reached into his coat and withdrew the sealed jar. The root. He threw it to the floor. It shattered. The smell was instant. Clove, vinegar, blood. The mirrors cracked. The figure recoiled, flickering, trembling, not in pain, but in indecision, as though reality had lost confidence in it. "You were grown from imitation," Holmes said, voice rising. "But truth is not symmetry, it is fracture." I fired once. The bullet passed through the thing, but it did not fall. It dissolved, layer by layer, like ash folding into mist. The mirrors cracked again, this time collapsing inward, their reflections pooling into blackness. We stood alone in a room with no walls, only a chair, now empty. Holmes turned to me. "It was never a person," he said. "It was a decision made real, but it has been unmade." I nodded, but did not lower the gun, because in that silence, something else lingered. Not a presence, a possibility, a root, deeper still. We emerged from the club into the late afternoon light, eyes blinking against the pale glare as though stepping not just out of a building, but out of something far older and darker. Holmes stood for a moment on the curb, unmoving. His coat was torn at the sleeve, and a thin smear of the root's scent, clove and something metallic, still clung faintly to his cuffs. I said nothing. It seemed a moment best left undisturbed by language. He turned slowly to me, and for the first time in days, his expression held not dread nor calculation, but a kind of calm. Fatigued, yes, but clear. He drew a deep breath, as though reclaiming the full use of his own skin. "It's done," I said at last. Holmes gave a faint nod. "As far as this layer reaches. And the others. They will recoil. For a time. Whatever structure lay beneath the mirror has been shattered. But nature abhors a vacuum, and so do those who seek to fill it." We walked in silence until we reached Baker Street. The world felt curiously normal, Omnibuses passed, dogs barked, a paperboy shouted the headlines about a shipping delay in the channel. The gas light flickered in the front window, and Mrs. Hudson met us at the door with the same concerned glance she always wore when Holmes came back from something unspeakable, which by now was often. Inside, the man from Greywit, the so-called heir, was gone. Collings said he had vanished sometime in the night, without a sound or trace. Drelincourt had returned to his cottage near Oxford, taking with him the fragments of the research, the sealed journals, and the warning Holmes had given him, "Bury your work where even your memory cannot find it." I don't believe he was the last of them, I said that evening as Holmes sat smoking by the fire, staring once more into the flames. "No," Holmes replied. "But he was the first to leave willingly. That suggests something." "What?" "That whatever was stitched into him did not hold. Something in him refused permanence." "Perhaps something human?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Perhaps." He tapped his pipe against the grate, then turned to me. "You know what the greatest danger of the garden was, Watson? It wasn't that they could mimic, or that they could replace. It was that they began to believe what they'd made was better." I nodded. The ideal is always dangerous when confused for the real. Holmes rose, stretched, and crossed to the shelf where his notebooks lived. He pulled the blank one down, opened to the first page, and wrote something I couldn't see. When he closed it, he labeled the spine in his neat script, "The Garden Hypothesis." Contained, for now. I watched him for a long moment, then said softly, "How do I know it's you?" He didn't flinch, didn't smile. He only looked at me with the full weight of memory and fatigue behind his eyes. "Because, Watson," he said, only the real Holmes would admit he nearly lost the thread. And I believed him. Later that night, as London exhaled into fog once more and sleep crept toward the edges of the city, I passed the study and saw Holmes at the mirror again, standing as he had that morning, gazing not into his reflection, but through it. I didn't disturb him, because some mirrors are no longer glass. Some are thresholds, and others warnings. And in the case of Sherlock Holmes and the rose that grew from stone, the truth was this. The garden had not been destroyed. It had simply retreated, waiting for recognition to fall asleep again.